So I want to welcome you to the first Faculty Professional Development Lecture of Fall 2021. Our topic today is a curriculum spotlight on sustainability, and our speakers are Dr. Ian Lambert and Melanie McClintock. Dr. Ian Lambert is the Dean of Graduate Studies and Chief Academic Officer at CCS. He has his PhD from the University of Edinburgh and is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy in the UK. In 2019, he completed a Carnegie-funded research project on designing with ocean plastic, and his work has been exhibited in the UK, China, and the US. Melanie McClintock teaches in the MFA Color Materials Design program and has her MFA from CCS. Her experience has included owning a boutique in Brooklyn, New York, teaching at VCU Qatar, and acting as the design project manager for the VCU Qatar's Center of Research, Design, and Entrepreneurship. Her work has been exhibited in Qatar, Indonesia, and the United States, and she's lived and studied in Java, Italy, and Detroit. So welcome to both of you. I'm super excited to hear your presentations. So we're going to go ahead and we'll hear from Dr. Ian Lambert and then Melanie, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So whenever you're ready, Ian.
Thank you very much, Amy. Okay, just to start by explaining what I'm going to do right now. Can you all see my first slide of my presentation? When Amy and I met, when Melanie and I met last week to discuss how we were going to do this, I showed her 4 different lectures that I had in mind, and I went through them super fast to explain each one. And I said, which one should I choose? And she suggested that I just did exactly what I did with her and go through them super fast. So this is going to be a kind of a speed lecture on how we sort of design for climate action as we move forward. So I'm going to get on with it. So when we think about sustainability, as it was taught in design schools, the examples that we had in the 1980s often showed these things that were maybe often referred to as skip rating, where people would take these discarded objects and integrate them into a design solution. And then sometimes even take existing objects that were perfectly good, usable objects for what they were designed for, to make them into less useful objects in their new reincarnation. And some of these ideas, they're all very nice, but they're not even scratching the surface of the sustainability problem that we have in design. If you take, for example, the wine carafe here designed by Todd Bunchy, it offers an approach to how we might take a discarded wine bottle and turn it into something else. But when you think about sort of wine consumption, I know I drink more than 1 bottle of wine a week. This is only just a mere token of a solution to dealing with this recycled glass. So when we think about these things, it is not enough to simply take an old material and turn it into something new. Okay, this is just one approach, and it's a minute approach in this. Also, what we have to consider is what we do with products when they reach the end of their life. Okay, when we think about this notion of putting stuff in the trash, when we think of a product, we throw it away. But the question has to be asked: where is away? Where does it go? And we know this: it'll either go to a recycling center or to landfill. But often when we refer to recycling, it's actually what we're often doing is downcycling. And that is that if we take something, for instance, like a PET bottle, and then use that as the source material for let's say, a fleece jacket, what's happening is that the PET bottle is stopping off as a fleece jacket on its way to landfill. This is really what Madonna and Brongart referred to as downcycling, slowing it down before it goes to landfill. What we need to be thinking of is the cradle to cradle, that we actually keep these materials in perpetuality in the industrial process and start working with a closed-loop manufacturing model, so that we take the PET bottle and we turn it into more PET bottles. Now that again is perhaps a sort of a more impactful solution, and we can sort of take these statistics and consider something like an aluminium can or a soda can, but actually when you recycle aluminium, it's actually 95% more energy efficient than actually taking bauxite ore from the ground and processing that as raw aluminium, because of the very energy intensive process that it takes to actually extract the metal from the ore. It requires enormous amounts of electricity using anodes to extract that metal. So recycling it is more energy efficient. That said, that there always has to be virgin material, always has to be added to these perpetual cycles, but it's much better to do that. Also, we've got to consider changing our lifestyle and thinking about how we can actually use less. So things like sharing are great examples. I have a friend and former colleague in Edinburgh who shares his vacuum cleaner with his next door neighbor. Okay, many of our electronic goods are only actually in use for about 5% of the time that we have them. There's one estimate from John Thackeray that suggests that a power tool is only actually used for 10 minutes of its entire life. So, why not have these kind of more sharing approaches so we actually make fewer of these objects and draw less on the world's resources? So when we think about all the kind of the technological fixes that we need to make these materials more recyclable, using less is really one of the answers that we've got to approach this from. But equally, thinking about how we ration what we use. Rationing has been used, there are examples of this, but not rationing sort of objects, but thinking about our carbon footprint rationing. Maybe those people that use a lot less carbon can sell their carbon rations to people that want to use more, but we try to limit people's impact on the earth. But when we think about things like recycling soda cans, it kind of almost pales into insignificance when you start looking at things like motor cars. It's all very well that we put in the trunk of our car a load of soda cans and drive them to recycle here, just over the road from here. But when you think about the actual impact of a car, there's a lot of metal, and there's several tons of metal in these cars. And we've got to start to think bigger about the impact of our use of materials, not just thinking in terms of recycling. When you actually then can put this into the context of a building, there's even more energy and weight and material that goes into a building. And Buckminster Fuller once famously asked the question of Norman Foster, how much does your building weigh? And this is a photograph I took in China several years ago of a building going up in Shanghai. And when you zoom in close, you can see these huge piles of steel, which are going to be used to reinforce the concrete. We've got to ask ourselves how much iron ore was extracted just for this building alone. And then when you think about this use of material and this impact of material in the context of a city, here is a picture of Shanghai, which has grown enormously in the last 30 years. In the 1990s, the early 1990s, the site where these three tall buildings are was actually just still kind of farmland. And the speed at which this city has gone up, you've got to try to imagine all of the steel, the concrete, the very energy intensive concrete that's been used in there, the glass, all the energy and power that's used to light and resource these buildings is an enormous draw on the world's resources. And it's estimated that 50% of the world's greenhouse gases come from the construction industry. So when you're thinking about recycling a soda can, we should still do it. We should absolutely still do it, but it pales into insignificance when you consider the resources that are drawn into things like buildings. It's enormous. Okay, so you can think about all this metal. This is the way that we kind of mine these things, a lot of open cast mining. Aluminium is quite abundant, but as I said, it's very energy intensive to take that ore and turn it into the actual aluminium itself. The mining of gold, it's a metal that we don't maybe use a lot less of, but it's important in electronics. Can be very, very detrimental to the environment. Iron, copper, we all need these minerals. Now, here is a very interesting infographic that comes from the prologue of Orwood and Cullen's book, Sustainable Materials with Both Eyes Wide Open. And it illustrates the amount of material per person used in the UK each year. This is a UK statistic from 2012, but it's an incredible infographic. And what you've got to understand is that this one person is using several times of their own self in volume of coal or concrete or paper, steel, plastic, and glass. And you see on this diagram, the glass, that's the blue figure here, and the plastic and the aluminium is this tiny little figure here, are very small parts of this overall larger use of material. And that accounts for all of the concrete that is used for any kind of civic infrastructure, any road that's built, any public building that's built. This accounts for personal use of this material. Okay, this accounts for personal use of the energy that's required to process all these materials as well. And it's an extraordinary amount, and we've got to get this number down. Okay, so one of the ways in which we can do this is to think about circular economic thinking, circular economy, bringing things back into the cycle of not just the economy, but the way that we make things. So there's kind of closed loop manufacturing and thinking about designing things for disassembly so that they can be easily disassembled and then easily reclaim those materials. Okay, so we're looking to go from an infinite growth economy, which is what we're still locked into right now. Okay, infinite growth means that we are taking stuff from the earth and we're growing the economy, but we're not giving it back. Okay, this circular economy means that we start to think more carefully about the environmental stewardship and actually returning those materials. Part of the barrier for this, which is mentioned in Serge Latouche's book, A Farewell to Growth, is this: there are three hindrances to this. And he talks about advertising, which creates the desire to consume, credit, which gives the means to consume, and products with built-in and or planned obsolescence, which means that we always need new products. Now, the idea of planned obsolescence is another lecture in itself, and I would suggest that you watch the film The Light Bulb Conspiracy to look further into this. But planned obsolescence is when we just make products that break, so we have to buy new ones. And again, this is not sustainable. Okay. So we need to move into a circular economy, but this is a long way off. This is a very difficult transition to make. When we go from an infinite growth economy to a circular economy, there's going to be casualties along the way, and that transition is very, very hard indeed to do. And I sort of liken this to, let's say that we decide that we're going to drive, instead of driving on the right-hand side of the road, we're going to drive on the left-hand side of the road. If you do it overnight, there's going to be a lot of casualties the next day. But equally, you can't do it gradually. It's really, really hard. You can't do that gradually because then we'll all be driving on different sides of the road. How we implement this is going to continue to be an incredible challenge. And I think it's something that's more likely to come from the bottom up, from the grassroots level, than is actually going to come from the top down, from any sort of big political will. Okay, I'm going to move into part two. Am I going too fast or am I going at the right speed? We're going fine. Okay, I'm going to move into the second part now, which is this idea of the war on plastic. And I put it to you that the idea of a war on plastic is actually ludicrous. We need to make peace with plastic. Because plastic, although it's very problematic as a material, is also an incredibly useful material as well. The idea of going to war with it will be nigh on impossible to live without it. Think about where you experience plastic in your lives. The computers that you're watching this from, the clothes that you're wearing, all of your underwear is held up by plastic. Your shoes have got plastic in them, your cars have got plastic in them, your homes have got plastic in them. We can't live without plastic, but it is a very problematic material. One of my areas of expertise is in designing with ocean plastic. I've done a lot of research with this on the west coast of Scotland. And you see these sites in very remote beaches, which are very difficult to access. This really illustrates how plastic is washing ashore. And where beaches are in quite are close to sort of highly populated areas, local people will clean it up. When you can't do that, you'd see the array of plastic material that appears on the beach. Now, this is on the west coast of Scotland in the Isle of Harris. It's a tiny little islet off the coast, just off the Isle of Harris, where there were some holiday homes, and some people that used the holiday home there have been there since the late 1980s. And they observed this is anecdotal evidence, but they observed this, that the variety of objects we find on the beach has been in decline since New York stopped dumping their rubbish in the sea in the early 1990s. And New York stopped dumping their rubbish in the sea in 1994, and the variety of objects decreased on this beach since that point. And you've got to think about it, that up to that point, they were taking garbage out 100 miles out to sea and just tipping it in the ocean, which is just absolutely, it's insane to do that, but that's how people got rid of their garbage. And lo and behold, the prevailing currents took it across to the west coast of Europe. Thank you very much. But what it's also led to is the formation of these enormous ocean gyres. The first one was the Pacific Garbage Patch. That's this one up in the North Pacific, but they've identified 5 others now. There are these great floating plastic masses. Now, they float just below the surface of the ocean. And but they, some of them are estimated to be the size of Australia, to be, twice the size of France. You see all these estimates, but it's an enormous amount of plastic, and it's estimated that between 8 and 12 million tons of plastic goes into the ocean each year. It's almost impossible to get an accurate figure for that, but these are estimates that come from some of the research. And this installation from the Call from the Sea exhibition in Zurich in 2012 was where they filled a room full of ocean plastic that they estimated to be the amount of plastic released into the sea globally every 15 seconds, okay, around the world. Okay, so this is a real problem for us. But plastic is also problematic in other ways, that it's derived from oil, and we know that there are pollution problems with oil. This is just one example from the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster. We know the effects of plastic on wildlife, and we've seen the images of dead birds found with their stomachs full of ocean plastic that they've been eating, highly sensationalized images. And we know that we can recycle plastic as well, or some types of plastic, not all plastic. There's many different types of plastic. We know that we can recycle some types of plastic. And we need to start thinking about treating it as a more precious resource that we can reuse. And I think the way that we're using plastic is the issue. It's not the fact that we have it. It's highly useful in things like medical products, but we've got to treat it as a precious material. We've got to get into this idea that plastic is precious, not something that can be discarded. And think about that every time you do discard of a piece of plastic, but also think about the different types that we're using. Ocean plastic is notoriously difficult to recycle because it photodegenerates after long exposure to sunlight. It also attracts a lot of organic matter to it, and it goes very brittle in the salt water. But then there are these alternatives to it. Victor Papanet talks about this in his book, The Green Imperative, how he recounts a story that in the 1950s he was working in a museum, where in the corner of when objects in the museum were sent on loan, in the corner of the packaging department where he worked, there was a huge popcorn hopper. So instead of using polystyrene beads, instead they'll just make up a load of popcorn and use that to package the items. That's got a really lovely idea, but we've got to also consider how much resource it takes to make these organically based plastics, these bioplastics. Now, making it from waste, as we saw in the Biodesign Challenge, and I think Mel's going to talk about that later, is one way we can do this. But if we're growing crops specifically for plastic, we've got a problem. We've got a contest between plastic production and food production. It was an issue that arose when people thought that palm oil was going to be the future of fuel for cars. It's never going to happen because you get that conflict with food production. So it brings to the fore this notion of natural versus synthetic. And we tend to think that anything that's made of natural materials must be better than synthetic materials. That's to say that cotton must be better than polyester because cotton is a natural material. But let's consider that for a moment, because cotton is incredibly energy intensive. Okay, it needs to be grown in great big industrial farms because the volume in which we use it in the world is enormous. We need to harvest it, and it's used in many things. Not least our clothes, our bedclothes, our towels, our bedding. Okay, but think about the process that it goes through. This is a very, very simplified diagram here, just to get to the point. But you've got to harvest it, you've got to sort it, you've got to wash it, spin it, weave it, bleach it, dye it. Then you've got to fabricate the items. You've got to transport it, put it into retail for a lovely white T-shirt, which we may only buy for $4.99. Okay, and then you may wear it once or twice, or you may wear it once, it becomes a paint rag and then goes into landfill. And cotton is notoriously difficult. If treated in this way, it can be very difficult to recycle. Whereas polyester, on the other hand, may not have the same processing of this, may not have the same carbon footprint of this. It may be a more higher performing material. And it's been put to me by some people that actually in years to come, we'll only have polyester clothing. There will be no cotton clothing. Okay, something to consider, that just because something is natural, that the natural versus synthetic argument doesn't always add up. Be careful of that. Okay, and also there's the human cost. I just throw this in there because I love this piece. It's a piece of installation art by Yolanda Dominguez, which was in response to the Yana Plaza factory collapse, where she got paid models to take their shopping and lie on the street covered in building debris, which is just a very poignant kind of message about the actual cost of our cheap clothing. Also, it uses tons of water. Less than 3% of the world's water is actually fresh. So we've got to consider how much that takes. When you buy a pair of jeans, they've used a lot of water. If those jeans are pre-distressed, i.e. faded jeans, you're using even more water. Never buy, I would say never buy pre-distressed jeans, but perhaps we should never buy jeans. So a lot of our clothing is problematic. Now, I'm going so fast. Okay, so I want to just quickly talk about distribution as well, because transportation is a problem for us. Let's just quickly look at a bicycle. And, if you take a bicycle backwards through the process from the point of sale, there's some that say that a bicycle has been 5,000 times, 5.5 times around the world before you actually get on it and start riding it. Okay, now I'm going to try and illustrate that with it. This is my sort of back of a napkin kind of illustration of that statement. Okay, so you go to the shop, there's a local distribution warehouse, there's a packaging plant, there's an assembly plant, there's a factory for the frame, there's an aluminium processing plant for the factory for the frame, the frame. There's also the bauxite mine to get the aluminium. Then there's the factory for the saddle, factory for the tires, oil refinery processing, oil well, factory for other parts, steel mill, etc., etc., etc. Then there's the transportation. Okay, so if it's been around the world 5.5 times, how is that the case? Well, you've got to look at all the different parts of the bicycle. Think about the frame, the wheel, the saddle, the gears, the chain set, the pedals, and think about where these may have been manufactured. Now, this diagram is something that it's a hypothesis here. It's speculation, but let's just say these are the various parts of the world that these things were made. These are areas of the world which manufacture these kinds of things, and then they've got to be shipped. And then they also rely on materials that come from other parts of the world. So that material has got to be shipped to the factory to make those parts. And then we think about the journey that various parts make around the world as they actually come to form their assembly. And then from the assembly part to their distribution point here, you've got to think about the journey that they take as well. So when you're taking something as simple as a bicycle and breaking it down in this way, we need to consider that kind of locality and the proximity to where all those parts come from. Okay, now I need to do a lot of research to get this diagram accurate, but it's a hypothesis. Okay, but when we think about bicycles, let's now think about cars. Cars are infinitely more complex than bicycles. They're a lot more complex than bicycles. They have many, many more parts to them. And we need to consider where all these parts come from for all these cars and the actual resource each car makes, but also the amount of energy that cars use. And cars are growing and growing and growing. So, and also in terms of transportation, I wanted to show you this kind of thing. Can you see this? I've got a little block on the top of the screen here. Can you see? It's marinetraffic.com. I suggest you take a look at this. You can click on there's a live traffic of all of the shipping in the world at any one time. And you can click on any one of these individual vessels and see what type of vessel it is. And a lot of these ships are cargo vessels. Now, it's a contentious issue, but there are reports that suggest that the biggest 15 to 25 of the largest super ships produce more sulfur pollution than all of the world's cars. And that sounds like a very sensationalized claim. And of course, shipping uses a much more crude and unclean form of fuel, but then put this in the context of a ship, which is much, much, much bigger than a car, and has a huge engine room, a huge engine, which is running all the time. It's always running, whereas cars are usually parked 98% of the time, and they'll obviously burn a lot less fuel, and they're burning cleaner fuel. But just think about that, the energy that's required to get our shipping from one part of the world to the other. Just think about that for a moment. That is an impact that we have to consider when we're thinking about a curriculum. Okay, lastly, last part, and I think I'm going to do this in under 20 minutes. Last part of this is just food and water. It's something else we've got to think about as designers. We've got to think about this notion of food miles. So here's an example. This is some research that I was doing about 20 years ago in southern Spain. And as you fly in, if you take a holiday from the UK and you fly into southern Spain, you look out, you'll be struck by the amount of polytunnels. These are polythene tunnels that are used for growing food in southern Spain. And one of Spain's biggest exports are fruit and vegetables. And actually, what they're really doing when you're exporting let's say a tomato around the world is you're actually transporting a lot of water that's in that, because it requires a huge amount of fresh water to grow these vegetables. And what that's leading to is a problem of desertification, particularly in Almeria in southeastern Spain, where you see this got a great landscape. A lot of the trees have been removed here. This landscape is rich in gypsum, which is the source of plaster of Paris, which is used to render a lot of buildings. But to turn gypsum into something that will react with water and solidify again, you've got to burn it to get it into a powder. So a lot of the trees in this area were harvested and burnt. And we're getting this problem with desertification. And down here in this corner here, you can just see this tiny little oasis, but this river that runs down through this landscape is the only vertebrates that live in there now are terrapins, small turtles. A lot of the fish don't live in there anymore because the salt water is coming up from the sea, because a lot of the fresh water has been taken out of the landscape. And this idea of shipping food, halfway around the world, that in the UK, we were sort of importing pears and apples from Argentina, when actually in the UK, we grow pears and apples. Why are we flying it halfway around the world? Now, obviously fruit is seasonal and we want to get stuff out of season, but it's a problem. This idea of food miles is a problem, and people consume. The world population is fast approaching 8 billion. I've got a little counter at the end to show that. We consume crops, meat, fish, cotton. I've already talked about that. We consume a lot of timber. We extract lots of minerals. We also have this fresh water problem. And then you've got these kind of numbers here. This is actually an old one. I didn't update this, but if you go onto the worldcounts.com, you can get all sorts of statistics about what we are consuming around the world. And again, I need to go and verify these because I don't know what the source is, but it gives you an idea of the sort of things that the human race is consuming. Okay, and it all requires fuel and energy. So we need to think in these bigger systematic, with these bigger systematic pictures about how we actually transform and change our impact. And with a world population, as I said, that's approaching 8 billion, how do we feed 8 billion people? Okay, and when we think about food production, we think about rural areas, we think about the countryside, we think about nature. That's not the case. This farm is essentially a factory for creating food. It's factory farming. Okay, and we use lots of urea-based fertilizer, which is problematic. We use lots of pesticides. All goes out into the rivers and the streams. It's really having an adverse effect on our freshwater systems. We put this into big grocery stores. We transport it around. Then there's this problem with waste and landfill, how we deal with this food waste. We think about our food as well. We're very disconnected from the origin of our food. Now, how many people here have actually killed an animal and eaten it? Yes, there are people that have done this, but they're not many. We get someone else to do it for us. We go to the shop. We don't go hunting for meat. We go to the shop and we buy the meat. And you'd be right to think that it comes from a factory. We've got these living things, but we put them through a horrible factory process to arrive at this meat. And we have these factory farms. I've driven past these, and I drove past one in the highway in California a few years ago, and the stench was just terrible. And also, these farms are now, used to be things like rainforest, which are really important for us. So, food is an issue. There are some estimates that think we're going to run out of food in 30 years. Okay, we waste tons of food. There's an estimate that we waste 40% of our food each year because we buy too much stuff and we chuck it out. There's a move now to actually stop using sell-by dates and use-by dates on food, and just use your nose to determine whether something's good to eat or not. Okay, because people are just very untrusting. Oh, it's past its sell-by date, I'm going to throw it out. And actually, if you've got it in a refrigerator, it's perfectly good. I can go on about the impact of the refrigerator in the out-of-town shopping center as well. And just to finish, we also got to think about food waste in terms of what happens to it after it leaves our bodies. Because when you look under any city, go back to that picture of Shanghai, under that city of Shanghai before they built it, would be a large and elaborate sewer system that takes away all of our human waste. Okay, each of us will, if we're eating properly, will go to the toilet every day. I don't need to explain that, but we need an elaborate waste system to get rid of that. This is the Hundertwasser house by Hundertwasser, the artist, where he kind of came up with the Holy Shit Manifesto, which is where we actually keep our soil back and use it. And there are sort of forms of compost toilets that you can use as a way of dealing with human waste and returning that to the soil. But there's also real sort of health hazards with it as well. When before we were processing our human waste properly, there were some high cases of things like cholera. Anyway, just to finish, I'm going to do a very shameless plug. As of next week, we will start recruitment for the new MA, MFA in Design for Climate Action. And if you want to find out more, please do drop me an email. I think this is our first step to have a complete program that deals with these issues. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. That was incredibly comprehensive and very educational. Thank you so much. Melanie, are you ready?
Oh, well done. That's very hard to follow, Ian.
Yeah.
Yes, let me share my screen. Well, I feel like I need to take a moment after seeing that. Let's see. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Now I can't see the presenter mode. Okay. Oh, you can see everything. All right. There we go. So I'm going to speak a little more today. So I'm Melanie. I'm adjunct faculty in color materials design. I'm going to speak a little today about how I apply these concepts of sustainability within the courses that I teach. And I feel like it's important that I give out just a little bit of background into my my history, because it actually does is a huge part of how I teach and why I teach and why I incorporate sustainable design. In 2006, I competed in a tree hugger competition. It was to bring awareness to the fact that there are umbrellas and recycling. And I didn't win the contest, but in the process, I came up with a design that I ended up pushing forward, and actually was a material that I ended up using, looking at recycled umbrellas and nylon or polyester, depending on the umbrella, for the next 10 years. So it really shaped the way I looked at materials and ideas around waste materials. And so at the time I was living in New York, which if you've ever lived in New York and on a rainy, windy day, the streets and sidewalks and trash cans are littered with umbrellas. And when you think that 33 million umbrellas are sold in the US alone, and most of them are made to break upon use, single use, it's quite a vast opportunity for materials for me. I began to see this as an opportunity for my profession, for fashion. So then over the years, I went on to do some work in Doha, where I was teaching at VCU, as you mentioned, and bringing the idea of sustainability to the Middle East, and looking at concepts of zero waste. Again, I'm teaching within the fashion department, and then on to Indonesia, where I was able to again do some work there. And Indonesia is a very interesting place because they actually do understand the value of materials. And looking at when I collected umbrellas from there, I merely had to go to a recycling place, and they already had them separated. The aluminum was in one place, the nylon was in another. So very interesting narrative on place as well. Recently, I've shifted, as many of you might know, more into the footwear realm. And so I'm looking at sustainability and this idea of emotional durability. And so this connection to products. So this is a great example. This was a pair of boots that a friend of mine had for 10 years and loved, and you can see even the tape that's holding up the lining on the inside, just didn't want to let them go. And so I transformed them into a new pair of sneakers, with the hope that that would then extend the life cycle. Again, as Ian mentioned, I mean, it's all sort of like, it's creating that cyclical design is not always easy, and there are ways that to sort of shorten the line. So this is a quote that I love: "The most sustainable way is not to make things, obviously, but that's not going to happen because, unfortunately, that's what we do. We make things. I make things. I'm a designer. I'm an artist." But the second most sustainable is to make something that's useful. And so, or that it solves a problem that hasn't already been solved. And I feel like this is the most important lesson that we can teach our students. When I think about materials specifically and sustainable design, there are 4 sort of key criteria that I look at. And the first is that they're low impact. So that means they're non-toxic, they're sourced ethically, they could have recycled content, and it requires low energy or the least amount of energy to process. The second, as I already talked about, is that it's emotionally durable, that you're actually buying it to keep it, or that you're open to the idea of it being worn or aging, that you're willing to mend it. So that can come back to materials, it can come to the way it's made, the quality of the product. And the third is renewable resources. So looking at, really hyper focusing on local or regional resources, whether or not the materials are biodegradable, and of course, ideally compostable. This is a really great, I don't know if you know this one, this is made from gourds or squash. Yeah, it's a really great compostable idea for cups. And then the last is that there's an opportunity for, in my opinion, reuse. I agree with Ian that the recycling system is broken. If it's already headed to recycling, I feel that we've missed the mark. So designing things that could be reused or could be disassembled, and the parts could be reused. And if it has to go to recycling, then it's single material. So when Becca asked me to do this, there were 3 questions that she had mentioned. One was, how do classes at CCS prepare designers for our current climate? How do we build it into the curriculum? And then what are some examples? So 3 things that are like key focus for me is that we still stimulate creative thinking. So that's through lecture, peer discussion, practical workshops. I like to do a lot of making because I do think working with materials increases the understanding of the materials. And then just preparing students to conduct self-led research. And that's, social, cultural, political, economic, technological, and environment. It's everything. Because we need to identify what the problems are within all those spaces that in order to provide ideas for concepts. And then also to empower the students. I feel like it's really important that they feel that they can use their intuition as forecasters, finding resources, and then also just promoting circular approach to materials. As far as building the sustainability into our curriculums, I think conversations are the most important thing around waste streams, biotechnology, grow materials, the idea of better materials over perfect materials, and then to encourage responsibility. So I think that it's really easy as a designer to choose based on aesthetics without thinking about the practical aspect of the material. So I think it's from so whatever materials are used to create the processes of creation, and then the spaces in which they're created. So this is the good stuff. This is where I should share some examples of what's actually being done in the classroom. And I started with just more conceptual first. So in the trend forecasting class, we did a 3-week project where the students did a CMF trend blog. And for each week, they had a different problem that they had to solve and blog about it. Research, and there was a little bit of making still, just to sort of like this rapid prototyping. And 2 of them that I pulled out was, one was the color dilemma. So, Ian touched on it about this natural versus synthetic, and this idea that natural is supposedly better. But when you're talking about color, that isn't always the case. So that while natural color seems like the best alternative, there are definitely instances where that can actually be very detrimental to the environment. The second one is on empathetic materials, and this one, the students actually were given a product from IKEA, who has made a pledge for a 2030 climate positive sustainable plan. And so they looked at their materials and decided, was it really climate? Are they there yet? And where could they go to actually make their materials better? And this was an example of one of the blogs. I've just formatted it a little bit so you can see the depth of it. So this was about indigo as a color and the history, starting off with the historical references and then looking into different domains and industries. And then environmental. Ian also mentioned about denim. That's a big part of the indigo industry. So it was a really great discussion about across, all different sectors about how indigo can be both beneficial and negative on the environment. The second was focused on the materials. So this was where they were given the IKEA product to redesign. And so, for example, instead of the polypropylene, they suggested a cork or felt. Looking at alternatives to plastics, using recycled ocean plastic or bioplastics as an alternative to ABS. Okay. So this is a different course. This is our Applied Materials and Processes course. And typically this is a lecture and field trip based class. And this was prior to COVID. So now with COVID, last year we were a little limited in our ability to go out into the public. So, but this year, 2019, we looked a lot at waste streams and eco leather and concepts of cradle to cradle. This was a trip to Belle Isle that we did, that we collected plastic litter from the beach. And this was a project that one of the students did. I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to try to talk a little bit faster. I'm not as fast as Ian. So this was just a couple hours of picking up litter, and there was 5 of us in one location. This was the hull of one student. And then the idea was for them to select one material and do a deep dive and talk about different sustainability issues, and really interesting that this was this is the fishing line that he chose, which often I don't think a lot of people think about something as small as this, but it's actually quite a large problem. Also recyclable, the material itself, but being able to collect the material, nearly impossible. We also invited experts in the field. We had Caitlin Hoey, who's the organics materials engineer at Stellantis. She came and gave a presentation, also introduced the students to the idea of life cycle assessment, which looks something like this, but like the pathway. And then the students created their own sort of cradle to cradle assessment. So using something within their environment, the students, instead of doing a cradle grave, added the extra component to intervene. How would they intervene to make it a cradle to cradle product? Again, Applied Materials and Processes. We invited Rebecca Burgess from Fibershed, who is looking at soil regeneration and natural fibers and materials, color materials, as well as local Detroit initiatives, Kayla Powers and the Color Wheel. And then the students did a workshop where they actually experimented with natural color applying to textiles. For a studio class, we did a project. We had Julia Reed from Dark Container come talk about recycling and plastic and the future of single-use plastic. And students worked with biomaterials to create alternatives to plastics. This was an interesting project. I had never really considered about the plastic that's used in IVs, and especially with COVID, the increase of IVs, and these are incinerated. And then a project around looking at packaging in beauty. And this was actually made from loofah, which could then have a multi-use. The last is the Biodesign Challenge, as Ian mentioned. We had 2 projects that were standouts in this. One is actually up for a Creative Conscious Award, which is tomorrow. That's my shameless plug. So they're semi-finalists. They don't know what the award yet is, but they're definitely up for something. And this was around creating biomaterials for sanitary napkins, which I have a video, but I'm aware of the time. So, and then the last is the Reform Project, which I think most of you have heard about. They were the overall winners at the Biodesign Challenge. And they questioned about the ideas of consumer packaging and the limitations of packaging, why the materials were so permanent. I also have a video for that if you haven't seen it. And then that's it. So do we have time to watch this one video? The other ones, okay,
Yes.
because this one's really short. It's kind of a teaser.
What if we are currently wasting the opportunity to advance sanitary materials? What if materials could enable people with periods to have agency over their health? What if those same material properties could enable us to program material decay? The waste streams of chitosan, cranberries, and nettle are just the first steps in reimagining our menstrual futures. The Blot Project's materials, chitocran, nettle core, and cranhesive, advance sanitary products by leveraging waste as a resource and empowering people with periods through education and self-monitoring. If we can own our health, build with discoveries, and reduce waste streams, we can create for the future.
Melanie, I think we also have time for the other video if you're wanting to show that as well.
Okay, I can start, and then if it's right, let's see.
Welcome to Reform, Reformation of Thermoforming Materials. Since 1964, vacuum forming has become one of the most common methods of processing plastic materials. The process involves heating a plastic sheet until soft and then draping it over a mold. A vacuum is applied, forming the sheet onto the mold. Once cooled, the thermoformed sheet can be removed. Vacuum-formed products are all around us and play a major part in our daily lives, from yogurt cups to hot tubs. Many consumer packaged goods, or CPG, utilize vacuum-formed materials for a very limited existence. Although they serve a temporary function, the materials used in the process, such as ABS, polystyrene, PVC, polycarbonate, and polypropylene, have lasting effects on the environment. Because of this, 30 states in the US currently have some form of legislation regarding banning commonly thermoformed plastics. These legislations have led companies to seek new and alternative material development in accordance to our global shift away from plastics. We spoke to Julie Reed, industrial designer at packaging solutions company, DART, about how they are reacting to these shifts.
It is something that we are actively working on. We have entire departments allocated towards doing research and development.
So we have to question, if thermoformed materials in CPGs require a limited existence, why use materials with such permanence? To solve this problem with a circular mindset, we aligned ourselves with the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goal number 12, which is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. We created a list of criteria for our material. This introduced us to a field of industrial food byproducts, the materials left behind with no sustainable use case in their life cycle. Our search for byproducts led us down several avenues, from orange peels to eggshells and many more. We selected local byproducts, spent grains, and sugar beet molasses based on the properties we discovered and the added sustainability factor of locality.
Thank you, Melanie. That looks really interesting.
Most consumed
I do want to make sure we leave some time for questions, but I wonder if it would be okay if we could maybe share that link in the description of the video when we post it on YouTube.
Yeah, I'm fine with sharing this presentation as well if anyone.
Great, thank you so much. So at this point, we can open it up to questions. We haven't had any questions come through in the chat, but there have been a lot of resources. Ian has provided many links as well as others. But there was one interesting comment from Catherine, who said that an environmental scientist I know always says that recycling is more of a reminder to people to care about and consider the importance of environmentalism. So that was something that I had not heard, but I thought was very interesting. Are there any questions from the audience at this point in time?
Amy, I have a question if no one is ready to go.
Yes, please, Michael.
This is Michael. I'm hiding behind a blank screen because I'm wearing a white cotton t-shirt and I'm ashamed of it. But that's of course for style reasons. So thank you both for an amazingly rich presentation. There are lots and lots of questions, practical questions that one could ask if we had more time. But I want to sort of try and get to a core question, a core issue, to see your response. You are sharing with us what I would call a critical practice. We would all, I think, recognize as a critical practice that there is an element of critique, and we're asked to consider retraining our habits as well as expectations. But I want to propose the following, that critical practice on this scale can't be meaningful. I mean, it's meaningful, but can't be remotely effective to the scale of the problem unless it is part of a social practice. And I'm using the term social practice there, not as anything to do with the art movement social practice, but as it were, the scale of economic, political, and social behavioral changes that would be expected, that our social practice about how we shop, our social practice about what we recycle, that this critical practice would need to be embedded within a deeply transformed notion of social practice, and that would be part of the critical practice to address the need for new social practice, not just here are the ideas of what we can make more efficient. And one reason for that is something that I think is absolutely fundamental, which is the Jevons paradox. And the Jevons paradox is the idea that when, it's not the idea, this has been proven since the 19th century, that anytime we make a technology more efficient, we inevitably and necessarily will consume more of the thing that we thought we were going to conserve.
Two very important points there, MSR, and I think that, to the first one, I saw Glenn Adamson speaking, the art and craft writer Glenn Adamson,
yes,
in 2017 at the Making Futures conference, and he made the statement. I briefly touched on it in the presentation that we got to think about the ground up, because we have a tendency to look to these great mighty politicians that are going to come in and change these things that really need to be affected on a micro scale. So your big world leaders are dealing with maybe some of the bigger world problems, and they're not going to get so granular with these kind of social practices that we need to affect to get this change. And you're absolutely right. It's so difficult to bring people around to it, because when Al Gore made the film The Inconvenient Truth, the truth is very inconvenient, and the convenient path of least resistance to us in the moment is to just carry on as we are. Making those transitions are very, very difficult indeed. To your second point, it's often the case that people propose, you see it a lot in student projects where they propose a sustainability solution, which is actually only making the problem worse. You're either proposing a sustainability solution, which is just making more crap that we don't need. I've made this bag out of banana skins. We don't need a bag. We need fewer bags, but we need a bag that's going to last longer. We need it to be made out of something that's more durable than banana skins. Although, Vince has made the comment in there about indigenous knowledge. I'm not suggesting that these kind of natural materials might be used in a different way, but this is the point: is that people often propose solutions that are just adding to the problem.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So,
yeah, Vince?
So I wonder if I could just, because I threw something in the chat about indigenous knowledge, and then Catherine made a comment back about it being mainstreamed. And the point I guess I'm wanting to make is exactly the opposite, and it dovetails into what Michael is talking about, and that is before the Europeans came to what we now know as the Americans, the indigenous peoples lived in this environment, and essentially what the Europeans saw as the wilderness was a continental garden, which they cultivated and inhabited sustainably. And so, at the beginning of Ian's presentation, he noted advertising credit, planned obsolescence, and all of those things are about, and hold on to your hats here, what Karl Marx noted as the cycle of capital, which is we have been taught that money helps us acquire goods and is a matter of exchange, when in fact money is the first issue for which commodity becomes the mechanism to get more money. And so where does design fit into that cycle? That's kind of this notion of circularity versus continual improvement. And what Michael is talking about is what Depeche Chakrabarty terms the distinction between the global and the planetary. And Buckminster Fuller said it well when he said there's two histories, the ones that men think they're writing and the real one, which is called evolution. And we're at that point really where the global or humankind's history and the planetary have kind of coincided. And so, I think that it's great that it's embedded in design practice, but as Michael says, it needs to be a broader consciousness. And where do we fit in as, CCS in helping to at least change that mindset?
I can offer a comment, maybe not an answer to that, Vince. And I think that your comments on indigenous knowledge is very important. It's actually coming up a lot in our D-Tree studio project, which where we're acknowledging various types of knowledge and various types of cultures that we need to engage with as we deal with our own material culture. But one thing that's I've observed is in reading literature about design decolonization is that there are striking similarities. In fact, they're almost identical in that what we need to achieve a circular economy is to deconstruct the existing systems that we have now and build new ones that are fit for purpose. And the decolonization literature asks for the same. We need to deconstruct the existing power structures and economic power structures and rebuild new ones that are fit for everybody. It's not about assimilating people into the existing structures that we have. And it's not this, I don't think it's enough to try to assimilate even some of our sustainable practices into these systems that we have. We need new systems. We've got to deconstruct and rebuild stuff that is fit for everybody. So and these ideas have been around for a while. Maria Louise just commented this, but the similarities are striking.
Thank you so much. And there's so much more that I would love to hear, particularly like what can we as individuals do? Obviously, we're talking global change as well as design, but unfortunately, we are almost at time. So I just wanted to say thank you again to Dr. Ian Lambert and Melanie McClintock for their fabulous presentations, which we will be posting on the YouTube channel. And to remind everybody that our next faculty professional development lecture series is a focus on faculty publishing, and that will be held Thursday, October 7th from 11:30 to 12:30. So thank you so much. We'll hope to see you there.
Just one very quick comment,
yeah.
And I've been very remiss, and thank you, Maria Louisa, for mentioning it in the chat, that I do need to mention the Cumulus conference in 2022 is very much aligned to this. That's a very important point. Thank you for reminding me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.